on today's StoryBeat.
What you need is an unbreakable concept. Like, the thing has to work, whether you have folding tables and box of props or $1 million production. It has to connect with the audience on an emotional level. No matter what the value spend any party is making, they have to connect with it. And this thing connected out of the gate immediately. And I just knew, I was like, we're onto something. But for a long time, we didn't know what we were onto.
This is StoryBeat with Steve Cuden, a podcast for the creative mind. StoryBeat explores how masters of creativity develop and produce brilliant works that people everywhere love and admire. So join us as we discover how talented creators find success in the worlds of imagination and entertainment. Here now is your host, Steve Cuden.
Thanks for joining us on StoryBeat. We're coming to you from the Steel City, Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. My guest today, David Carpenter, is the CEO of Gamiotics, a live entertainment software company that enables real-time communication between audience and content and is powering the next generation of immersive and experiential entertainment. Gamiotics' mission is to deliver authentic experiences through audience agency. David is a 20-year veteran of the entertainment industry and a Tony-nominated producer. He got his start many years ago at the renowned theatrical office of the Dodgers. Eventually, he became a Dreamworks Theatricals executive where he oversaw sales operations for Shrek The Musical. He's currently a managing partner in the new interactive experience, the Twenty-Sided Tavern, which brings a Dungeons & Dragons style role-playing game into the live entertainment space using Gamiotics technology to power audience engagement. In 2019, David was the lead producer of the Broadway run of Slava's Snow Show. He helmed the off-Broadway record-breaking comedy Puffs, which ran for 3 years in New York and is in the top 10 most licensed shows in the U.S. He produced Puffs in Australia for 2 years with a record-breaking engagement in Melbourne before touring to Sydney and Brisbane. He was also the executive producer of Puffs filmed live off-Broadway, which debuted on screen nationwide with Fathom Events and can now be viewed on any streaming platform. He's also lectured on producing at various universities like Columbia, Bucknell, the University of New Mexico, and the University of Florida at Gainesville. So for all those reasons and many more, I'm deeply honored to welcome the exceptional cutting-edge producer and director David Carpenter to StoryBeat today. David, welcome to the show.
Hey, Steve, thank you so much for having me on.
Well, the pleasure is all mine, trust me. All right, so let's go back in time a little bit. Where did all of your passion for live entertainment, for theater, where did it come from? At what age did you first think, wow, that's something I want to do?
Since I was 5 years old, right? I mean, like since the first time I ever saw a live stage production, and I all things I remember what it was, which was a high school production. My oldest sister's high school production of Oliver, right? And I just remember being entranced by this whole thing. And so when I was in elementary school, I was a technician behind the scenes on a Christmas show. And then I just always did theater from that point forward in my life, right? Like I've not been a part of theater a year of my life since I was probably in, 5th grade.
So the bug got into your veins very early on.
Yeah, and I come from an entertainment family. I mean, there is something you could say that it's in the blood, but I think more importantly is that the growing up, right, with relatives who are all in entertainment, there was no kind of obstruction to me doing this for a career. Right. It was like, oh, well, that's a natural. This is what he wants to do. That's what he's going to do.
It was right. The notion of it was around the house all the time.
Yeah, exactly. Right.
So that makes it a little easier for you. Unlike you, I had no one in my house that was into it. So I was into it and I had to kind of find my way. You might have had a little bit of guidance along the path.
I think my parents' generation isn't in entertainment at all. Right. It was my grandparents and the generations before that.
Right.
And so there were less guidance as much as like no one to stand in the way.
No impediment to it.
No impediment. Right. Yeah.
Because frequently someone will say, a parent will say, why don't you become a lawyer? Why don't you become a doctor instead of, why don't you go into show business? But you had nothing stopping you.
No, I think the only thing my mother said, and I 100% agree with her, was that when I was in high school and college, she was like, "Don't be an actor." And I was like, "All right." She's like, go into management, go behind." She's like, "Don't be an actor." And she was right. I
Why?
mean, like when I acted in college, but I was like, I don't want to be an actor. This isn't what I want to do for my career.
What was I'm curious what her concern or fear
So
was.
my mother, I will tell you, right? Because it's all about money. My mother was on the board of the Alliance Theater in Atlanta when I was growing up. So I was
Sure.
very fortunate that I went to every single play and musical that the Alliance did from when I was a young kid, right? All the way through high school and college, right? And I think my mother went at one point to Kenny Leon, the very story director, Broadway director right now, was
Sure.
the artistic director. My mom knew Kenny, and the managing director, whose name I don't remember anymore. And she went to the managing director at one point and said, "I think my son's going to pursue a career in theater." And the managing director says, "The average salary of an actor, a professional actor, is $30,000 a year. Get him to do something, get him to move into management." My mom took that advice and said, "You should work in management." Like, all right, well, okay, that sounds
So
good.
so it was a very practical reason. It
It
was
was a
that
very practical piece of advice.
you're going to be poor is the idea. So
Exactly. My mother did not want me to be poor, which I appreciate. That was very kind of her.
all right.
But
So then
but I think she was also, I mean, when I was in high school, I went to a very small high school. I went to a small high school in Atlanta, and we didn't. There were like 8 of us who did all the shows in high school, right? I mean, we were a very small theater department, right? It was and the reality was is like I liked doing everything. I would make the program, I would sell the tickets, I directed the fall play, like I did all of the other things, and that I was in the show. And so, when I was in college, like that never stopped. I always liked doing all of the things, right, associated with it. By the time I got to like my junior year, I thought I was going to become a director. And before I realized, like, I don't really like working with actors that much. Like, I like in rehearsal, but like because and like I really like just producing the shows.
mhm.
And so by the time I was graduating, even though I had a concentration in directing, it was like it's like in college when you're doing it all on your own, you're really the producer and you happen to be directing it as well. And so that's when I came to New York. That's what I pursued. I was like, well, I want to be on this side of the table.
So your degree is in the theater.
I have a theater and English. I have a double major in theater and English and a minor in dance.
Wow. You were
Of all
busy. You were
things, yeah,
busy.
yeah. Oh yeah, never stopped. Yeah, never stopped. Like just straight through. Yeah.
And so you learned to be a producer by producing, not by taking classes on producing.
You
Yes?
can't take a class on producing. I mean, there are classes. I mean, there are seminars, there are things, but producing is one of those jobs that no one can teach you really how to be a producer because there's something very ephemeral about the skill set that you need.
In what way? Explain.
You have to be a jack of all trades, right? You have to like one of my good friends who's a producer in New York had said to me, years ago, which is you have to know a little bit about a lot of things,
Mm-hmm.
right, in order to do that. And a lot of times, as we're coming up in our careers, we're specializing in various areas and we're going all in certain areas. But I started working in general management. I moved over to touring. I ran a ticket selling operation. I went back into sales and marketing. I ran group sales, and I went into sales and marketing at Dreamworks. And so a bulk of my career was in sales and marketing, how tickets get sold, like how, consumer behavior, all the things that are surrounding the movement, the consumer interaction with the ticket sale and into the show. And then when I stopped doing that, I moved fully into production and started on the developmental side in how does the sausage get made from another side of the table.
Right.
And so part of it is I took a class. I don't think it's running right now. I think it's existence right now. I think COVID might have killed it off. But there's this thing in New York called the Commercial Theater Institute, which the Broadway League runs, right? And a lot of people in the industry go through it at various points, like lots of producers do. And it's kind of a thing that all young wannabe producers tend to go through in New York. They go through CTI. And, I did a bunch of it. And I kind of came out of it and it's like, okay, I learned all this stuff I learned a lot of anecdotes and I learned a lot of things about the industry, but like, I didn't really learn anything about being a producer. And I think I'd said to a friend, I said, what are you having this conversation saying, like, what is a producer? And I was like, producer is someone who options a work. Like, that's where it starts. Like they buy a work, right? Or they lease a work from an author and that's it, right? Like once you do that, you can call yourself a producer, but if you've never optioned something before, you're not a producer, right? And that's just step one, right? I mean, there's obviously many, many steps that go beyond that. And so that's what I did. I optioned to play at 24 or 25, however old I was. and said, all right, I got to try and get this done. And of course I didn't get it off the ground, right? It was a $600 option of something that I cared very deeply about, but I couldn't figure out how to get it done. But at least I took that first step. So part of the other thing
let's
about,
go back a half a step, though. You had already produced some things like your own work and so on in school.
In college, yeah.
So you had a sense of what does it take to actually assemble the pieces and parts of what you call a show.
You put on a show, right? Yeah.
But there are all these little various pieces and parts that you have to assemble: actors, scenery, lighting, ticket sales, the arrange for the theater itself. All those things are pieces and parts.
But when you're in an institutional environment like a college, right, you take no risk, right? That's
true.
Yeah, that's the piece of the equation that is missing in a college environment, which is the university has taken all of the risk, right? There is literally no consequence to failure whatsoever, right? So you learn mechanics of how to assemble things. You're absolutely right about that, right? You learn what all the various pieces are that need to come together to make a production happen. That's true. But they don't teach you about, no one teaches you about risk, right? Like nobody does.
They don't teach you what the business end of the business is.
100%. That's a big part. And so I tell people, the producer is the one who takes the risk at the end of the day, right? And you're a Broadway guy, so you know this, that there are producers and then there are co-producers. And I always define co-producers as the people who didn't take the risk. The people who are betting on somebody else's risk at the end of the day.
So
right?
that would be the talent.
Sure.
Not the financing end of it. The financing end of it is the big risk. Yes.
Well, at the end of the day, and we are talking. Remember, we were talking commercial theater. Like, I'm not talking nonprofit.
Yes, commercial theater.
I'm talking purely commercial theater. At the end of the day, it's the risk, right? Like, that's it. Well, and it's a financial risk.
I think that many people don't think of producers as being creative types. They think of them as being mostly nuts and bolts and money and all of that. But really, you have to be a fairly creative person to be a theater producer.
The best producers are. I hesitate to use his name because it's very sullied, but one of the things about Scott Rudin is that as a creative producer, he had the best eye, right? Full stop. Scott built himself up to a place where everything was offered to him no matter what. And he got to pick and choose. But you don't get to that place unless you're producing hit after hit after hit. You look at someone like Kevin McCollum, you look at someone like Jeffrey Sellers, right? Like, they've got really good eyes in what is good and what matches up with consumer tastes at the right moment in time. And that is a creative skill, like being a tastemaker, because essentially that's what you're doing as a producer. You're saying, this is where I think the taste of the audience is going to be. You have to have creative juices in order to make that decision. It's not random, right?
A lot of it, I think, you'll correct me if I'm wrong, but a lot of it, I think, is a personal taste that has some sort of sense of what the public wants, so that it's not so elitist that you're not going to attract enough of a crowd.
Well, in my years working on Broadway, I always say you have, once from your first hit, right? We're certainly working in theatrical. A lot of producers tend to flame out after 10 years because their taste, they might have a moment in time where their tastes are right, and it lasts for about a generation, right? For about a decade. And then the world changes underneath them, right? And they don't realize it. And suddenly it's what happened to, I would say it's what happened to Jeffrey Richards for a little while, right? Because Jeffrey Richards produced August Osage County, which is one of the great American plays, right? It was one of the best things I've ever seen in my life. I think it was 4 hours long, and it was a massive hit on Broadway, right? You haven't seen something like that since the days of O'Neill. It was a beautiful, of course, his relationship with Steppenwolf, but he was the one who said, we're going to put Tracy Letts on Broadway. We're going to put this giant thing on Broadway, right? And it was a huge hit, and he had a lot of hits in his time. And then there was a period of about 3 years where everything he did was a flop, full stop. And you look at that and you're like, you moved out of the mainstream for a minute right now. You're not actually getting to what the consumer, what the playgoers want, right? And he's coming back now. He just did a David Mamet, which I'm not a big Mamet fan, but he's still producing, he's still acting, he's still taking risks. But you have about a 10-year period, right? And if you look, almost every storied office goes through that.
I think that success sometimes changes people's tastes too.
Yeah, for sure.
So when you start out, you have no money, your taste is a certain thing. Suddenly you make some money and your tastes may change because you have money.
Yeah, sure. I agree. You lose. I mean, because like you also lose. You kind of also lose track of what the average theater goer is doing and wanting to buy in your lives, because you're no longer an average theater goer. It's one of the problems with investment on Broadway, honestly, is that most of the investors on Broadway have nothing to do with the ticket buyers. They live in an entirely separate world.
Totally different bubble.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a totally different world. And so it's I feel it's a major contributing factor in the industry, it has been for a long time, of why so much substandard product gets produced, because it can get financed, right? I mean, like Broadway, I mean, the problem with Broadway is that the failure rate is astronomically high, right? Like, and it's not a business that any venture capitalist in their right mind would try and build a business out of. Now, there are a few exceptions, of course, that who have been very successful, but they're going to invest in business. It's not a real business, right? Like, it's just simply not. Like, nothing about it makes sense from a business standpoint. And because it's a business based on, and this is 100% true, you can't make a living, but you can make a killing, because when it hits, you're good, right? For a long time.
So I'm curious, what for you then attracts you? What for you makes a good story good, that you want to say, I want to be involved with that?
For me in my career, right, and what I'm doing, what I've done, and what I am doing now with my career, is that it's about making a connection to an audience, right? And I mean, this is kind of a good time to talk about Puffs, actually, because I learned all this. I learned a lot of this in Puffs. So
what is Puffs? What is it all about?
So Puffs is a parody that this playwright named Matt Cox wrote, that is a parody of the Harry Potter universe, right? And the story is that it's about three wizards who are summoned to wizarding school in England, and they're all sorted into the Puffs house, right? Because the houses in the play are the Snakes, the Braves, the Puffs, and the Smarts, right?
Nothing like Harry Potter, is it?
Right. Well, it's a parody of Harry Potter,
I know.
right? It's a very cleverly designed parody, right? Because the show doesn't use any IP whatsoever from the Potter world, like none at all, right? Well, you can't, right? Legally, you can't, right? And so it's allowed to survive because it doesn't actually bring brand confusion to the table, right? And J.K. Rowling hates it with a passion, like hates the show. Yeah, of course it does. So what it does is it follows these three wizards who are all terrible wizards over the course of 7 years as they're going through school. And at this school, there's this very, very popular boy wizard where all of the wonderful adventures do, and they're having their own kind of misguided journey over the course. And it's deeply, deeply funny, but it's also kind of deeply moving, which is the message of the story, is that instead of investing in celebrity, instead of investing in the heroism of somebody else, be the hero in your own story. And it's kind of the anti-Potter like philosophy, right? Which is like it actually goes against everything that she wrote, but it tells a different story, and it comments on the world that she wrote in a really different way, and comes to a different conclusion than the books do, which is why it's actually really almost a perfect parody in its own right. Why it's legally allowed to exist in the United States, right? So I am a huge sci-fi fantasy fan, right? Like I read everything. I still do. I'm a big video gamer. Like all these things are really important aspects of my life. And obviously when we get to Gamiotics, we talk more about that. And I'd read all the Potter books when I was in college and right out of school. That's about when they came out, right? I was a big Potter fan, but then like everything in my sci-fi fantasy world, I read the books, great, I'm done, and I moved on with my life, right? And I didn't really revisit them. And truth be told, they're not terribly original, and they're not terribly well written. They're just a really good story at the end of the day. She tells a story of the teenage journey that is very relatable to anyone in the world. I mean, that's why I think what she did do very successfully, and why those books are successful, because you really can relate to that teenage angst journey, right? And that feeling of being othered and all these things that the characters go through. So like I hadn't moved on from this, and I had a production company with a former business partner, and he had been following these artists, right? Because they'd come up through the Flea in New York and had done a bunch of stuff, and they reached out and said, hey, we're doing this, we're 5 performances only, we're doing this Potter parody, come check it out. And he went and saw it, and he said, you got to go down and see this. And it was around Christmas time. It was back in 2014, right? So going on, it was 8 years ago now. I said, I don't want to do that. He said, you got to go down and see this thing. I was like, all right, I'm going to go see it. I remember, because I didn't want to go see it, because I was like, I don't really care about Potter. Like it's not a big part of my life right now, right? And so, but I went down and see it, and he wasn't there. It was just me. And I was sitting at the bar, and I'm having a beer, and I'm watching, the show was sold out. Like people were talking about it and all these things. and I'm watching the audience stream into the theater, and they're coming into the theater dressed in robes with wizard wands, right? Like in character and everything. And I thought, if this is any good at all, this thing can make a fortune, because you have a full house of 120 people. And granted, it was a $20 ticket, but it was like a Tuesday or something ridiculous, right? Coming in to see this show dressed up. And I thought, I've never seen anything in New York that does that outside of things like Rocky Horror Picture Show, or the things that have really got their hooks in. And I went in and saw it. I'm like, this is funny. It's not great yet. It needs work. But I'm like, and I called his partner. I said, let's option this tomorrow. And he's like, what do you want to do with it? I'm like, I have no idea what to do with this thing. Like, I really have no clue. I said, but we will figure it out. And so we went to the office and said, we want to take an option on this thing, and we want to do it now. And the New York Times, the day after we optioned it, which was like probably 8 years ago today, I would think at this point, the New York Times review came out, and we're like, this is fantastic, right? It was the only Times review that the show ever got, but they reviewed it and they said, this is phenomenal. And it was great. It was a total rave in the Times for it. And a small review, right? Then we're like, oh, now we got to figure it out. So that's then where the producing thing came in. So, well, how do we do this? Right. First off, the lawyers had to take a look at it and be like, you can do this kind of.
Kind of.
But there were, we had to have some rules about how to execute it. I mean, a lot of the rules had to do with like, this is how you advertise a show. Like, this is the language that you need in order to do this. Like, because we had to be really careful about how we talked about the show everywhere we went, because you put a target on your back, and if the show ever became successful, her lawyers would come after us, which they did. Right. I spent 3 years battling her lawyers away from us, saying, no, we like, sue me. Take me to court. Like, just take me to court. Like, we're not doing anything wrong. You have no right to sue us. And it really was just saber rattling. Like, she's just a bully. Like, the irony of her is that she's just a bully at the end of the day. I have no respect for that woman whatsoever. Anyway,
that would be very ironic.
Yeah, but it's true. I mean, like, if you ask anybody in the Potter world who actually has had to have dealings with her, they would all say the same thing that I'm saying, which is like, no, she's a bully. She uses her lawyers as a shield to go after people and try and crush on the fandom. One of the things that George Lucas did very smartly in the early days of Star Wars is that he invited other people to create in his world, because he wanted to build a bigger universe. Anyway, not important right now. So what I was saying is, like, then the mechanics kind of came in and said, well, how do we produce this successfully? And so I built a production plan that allowed us to gradually grow the show by looking at it instead of because this was also at a time, again, back in 2015, when commercial off-Broadway was declared dead. You could not do anything commercially off-Broadway, right? Like, it was a desert. There was no money to be made. Like there's no way to do it. And I thought, I think there's a way forward, and it has everything to do with this fandom, because this fandom wants this show, but we have to move slowly in order to be able to grow it. And the challenge was...
So you knew innately that you had to develop the audience.
Yes, right from day one, right? Because we learned right from the beginning that the fandom in the Potter world back in 2015 was highly protective of anything Potter, right? You have an audience, especially like a younger, more millennial audience, who felt very attacked by the world for their love of Potter. I remember being on New York City subways and having that giant tome of a Potter book, and have strangers come up to me and be like, oh my God, is that the Potter book? And like talk to me in hushed tones, right? And it was just very much in the way that she set up the world in terms of the Muggles and all that, right? It actually was very true with how it worked in those early days. And as the brand grew and as things moved on, as you get into 2015, you have this fandom that's grown up with this, that is deeply protective of their love of it. So there were a lot of things that they were afraid of commercialism, right, by outside people. They're afraid of off-brand things. They're afraid of people making fun of them. And so we had to earn the acceptance and the trust of the hardcore fans, right? That was the goal in the early days of our production, which was in the fall of 16, we were really careful in making sure that how we talked about everything, how we reached out to people, how we talked to community, how we interfaced with the community was done in a way of saying, hey, we're actually here celebrating you. We're not making fun of you, even though this is a parody. We might be poking holes in this world, but we're doing it in a loving way and delivering a message that you're all really going to enjoy. And just kept really reiterating that point, so that when you got the hardcore fandom on our side, they then said to the rest of the Potter fandom, this is legit, go see this. And when you look at how Marvel relaunched their brand, and I'm not kidding, right? That's exactly what they did.
Sure.
Right back in the late 90s, is that they said, all right, we're going to start a journey right now, and we're going to get the people who care most about us on our side from day one. And then they never looked back. You know, we took that same tactic in being deeply respectful of the people who cared about this world and delivering them a product that celebrated them and bringing those things together. And I had a 3-year record-breaking off-Broadway run. As a producer, your job is to sell tickets. That's it, right? At the end of the day, you have to deliver a product that sells tickets. There's nothing else to the job at the end of the day that is more important than that, right?
Got to make the money back.
You got to make the money back for your investors. You got to make the money back, right? And so when I look at the things that I care about, right, I look at it from the perspective of, what does a fan think about this, right? What do they want to see? What is going to speak to them? And that's how that started. And I'm not going to say I knew that before Puffs, but Puffs taught me the power of how you use the art to connect with an audience, right? And delivering a product, delivering a show, a purpose driven to do that from day one, which is what, when I took Puffs on, which is what my mission was. There wasn't necessarily the authors. The authors just wrote a funny play, right? And he wrote a brilliant funny play, but my job was to deliver this to connect to a fandom, to build a commercial engine behind it.
So in this case, you had a little bit of a built-in audience because you were appealing to a very large pool of Harry Potter fans.
We had a massive built-in audience from day one.
So that's extremely helpful. So it's kind of like when you're working for Dreamworks, you already sort of have a built-in audience. You're not starting from scratch. They've never heard of Shrek before. No, they've heard of Shrek. In fact, they've seen the movie.
They've seen all 4 by that point, right?
Well, I mean, exactly.
You have a brand, right? Like you have something that
so selling into a brand is a little easier. It's not easy. It's just easier than having no audience recognition at all.
So can we talk about economics on theatrical for a second?
Please. How do you raise money, and how do you deal with money on Broadway?
One of the challenges in the theatrical model, right, in the stage theatrical model, is that your finances are tied to the size of the theater that you are producing in at every stage of the way, because it's tied to the amount of money you can raise. If you can make $100,000 a week total, you can't spend more than $100,000 a week. It's just math, right?
Yeah, sure.
So when you are a producer in New York, you are in the single most competitive media market in the country, like far and away, right? I mean, we're talking 23 million people in the New York DMA, and your advertising dollars don't go very far at all to connect with people. Because if you are one of the 23 million people that live in this area, how any type of advertising hits you costs an enormous amount of money for it to resonate, right? So, and we're talking like NFL, sports teams, Madison Square Garden, like they have deep pockets to spend to get those $23 million.
Yeah.
Because they have thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands of seats to sell every night. They have a higher gross potential. Where you're in a theater, a Broadway theater that has at maximum 2,000 seats, mostly 1,000 seats, some as small as 500, your gross that you can possibly make is not big, which means that your advertising dollars can't be that big. When you're an off-Broadway theater and you have, and this is what Puffs was, 200 seats to sell a night, you have this much advertising dollar. So you take a step back and say, well, how am I going to reach people? And, anyone, old school people will say, well, you got to have a hook. Like I say, you got to have a brand, right? Because there's no way that you're going to cut through and build a commercial operation that can last over time on spending $5,000 a week on advertising, right? There has to be enough of a hook and a word of mouth tied to something recognizable in order to make the thing work. And so when you look at some of the reason why, back to my earlier story of like these people are coming in dressed in wizard robes and carrying wands to come and see the show, I knew instantly that I didn't have to spend a lot of money to get to them because nobody else was trying.
Sure.
So I have replicated that now very successfully now in my career. Right? Because it was a great learning lesson.
In other shows. In other shows,
yeah. So that is the ultimate challenge that Broadway has. Why do we produce so many movies turned into musicals? So they already have brand recognition.
Absolutely right.
Right.
It's all
right?
about.
Why is Wicked such a hit? Everybody knows Wizard of Oz.
Well,
Everybody does.
I'll use my own example. People will go to see a show called Jekyll and Hyde the Musical because they think they read the book in high school, which most people didn't, by the way. But many people think they've read it and know the story because they've seen the movies, they've seen whatever. And so you're already built in going in.
Yeah. And you're in a highly competitive environment, and your pathway to take that $100, $150, $200, like, like these things from that consumer, like is really, really tough. So you have to be smart and navigate it, and you have to have these tools in your toolkit, which includes brands, which includes knowledge, right? Jekyll Hyde's a great example.
Do you think of yourself as a more of a marketing person than a producer, or is it just all part of the same thing?
It's all part of the same thing. You have to know it all. You have to be able to do it all, right? I have spent a lot of time in sales and marketing, but again, I think that my job is to sell tickets, so I stay on the marketing ball more than anything.
Well, ultimately, that's what you need to do in order to make some profit.
Yeah, 100%.
What is it about marketing that you're able to tap into in certain ways? Is it because you are able to observe the market better than others? What is it that makes you a good producer and a good marketer? What is it?
Well, part of it is knowing how and when to spend money. Like that.
And how do you know that? When do you, how does one, is it just gut instinct?
So I am currently producing a show in Chicago right now, right? Mm-hmm. And I would love to, we'll talk about this at length, but I'll give you a teaser on it. And the show is called the 20-Sided Tavern. It's a live entertainment, Dungeons and Dragons style game experience, right? That's very story-driven show, right? And again, I'll get further into it, but our fan base is gamers and D&D players, right? And
D&D, for listeners who don't know, is Dungeons and Dragons.
Dungeons and Dragons, right? I know who our fans are. I've been producing the show for well over a year now. Of course, I am a fan. I am a fan of D&D. I'm a fan of all the stuff that we're doing. And because I partnered with Broadway in Chicago, who are phenomenal people. I absolutely love them. But traditional theater marketing has their playbook of how they sell tickets to their theaters, right? We got on this conversation about a TV buy, and I said, absolutely not. That's a terrible idea. We're not going to do a TV buy. And they said, we have to. I said, we don't have to do anything, but you shouldn't do a TV buy. Argued for a month with them, right? And I finally was just like, all right, you know what? Look, I've never produced in Chicago before. It's your market. If you say a TV buy is going to work, but I'm going to warn you, I don't think this thing is going to work whatsoever. And you're going to spend money, and you're going to buy TV, and it's going to, and I'm telling you, it's not going to return anything, but let's see what happens. This is something I want to be wrong at. We started the TV buy, and when the data started coming through because it takes a couple of weeks for TV to hit and all that, right? Data started coming through. The TV buy returned nothing. I mean, absolutely. I mean, a massive amount of money was in it. I returned absolutely zero. And I said, what you're failing to appreciate is the people who are buying tickets to my show no longer have cable and do not watch broadcast TV at all, right?
It's all on their phone. There
was a data point that we did a video buy. We did an ad buy on Twitch, a non-traditional video buy. And our playthrough rate on Twitch, like people full playthrough of the video, and this is like a 30-second video, was 91%.
Wow.
Meaning like they saw it, they watched 91% of the people who saw that ad sat and watched the entire thing through, right? And I said, that's where they are. And it's mind-blowing to a theatrical organization that you could sell tickets to Twitch. Most of them don't even know what Twitch is or even understand it. But I said, the problem is that you did your playbook, but we're not producing a traditional theatrical product, and my fan base is not sitting watching TV at all anymore. And we cut the TV buy immediately, cut it off.
There was a time where you couldn't do a show anywhere without advertising in newspapers.
No one, yeah, exactly.
Who advertises in newspapers anymore?
No one advertises.
There are no newspapers.
There's also kind of another important part of marketing concept, because I go through Chicago, but I'll relate this back to PUS. So you do an off-Broadway play, any advertising agency is going to say, you got to get it out. You got to advertise. You got to put it out there. You got to put it out there, right? You got to buy ads. You got to brand the show. And every advertising agency I've ever worked with is just a room full of liars, just full stop. And I'm not saying that they're bad people. I'm saying that they're not aligned with your mission. The goal of an advertising agency is to get the client to spend as much money. If the show's a hit, awesome, right? Then they'll be able to run it for years. If it's a flop, it closes, they move on to the next thing. But their goal is to run up as much ad expense in the first 3 months of your run as they can. Every advertising agency does this, right? So I had this advertising agency that I was working with on Puffs, And they were like, we need to do this buy. We need to buy. And I said, no, we don't. And they said, we have to do it. They want to spend like something like $70,000. They want to empty out my bank account of my ad dollars. And I said, no, I mean, like, we're not going to do this. I said, because it's not going to work. Like, you're just going to put our image all over the city, but no one knows what the show is or what's it about. It's not going to resonate. We have to, as I said, we're going after the hardcore fans. We're doing this. We're selling a person at a time. We're doing this the hard way, right? And I had read Malcolm Gladwell's The Tipping Point, and it was a big influence on me because I thought it was a really smart analysis about how grassroots moves to mainstream when you're selling products, right?
Mm-hmm,
and a lot of the things that he had in his book centered around the 10,000 number, right? The Beatles in Germany, right, played 10,000 hours together in Hamburg as a band, and then they came back to England and they were masters of their craft and went on, right? And that's the thing about the Beatles, like, they're masters at all their crafts, all as artists, they really are. But they put in the work, they put in the 10,000 hours. When you're looking at selling products, there is something significant about the moment when you move 10,000 units or 10,000 tickets in a market, because no matter how big or small that market is, once you have 10,000 people, and if the show's good, the show's got to be good, right? If it's bad, it doesn't matter, but the show's got to be good.
Sure.
The show's good. Once you have 10,000 people talking about your thing, it turns into a megaphone for whatever it is you're doing. And there's just something about that moment after 10K that's when you dump the ad dollars, right? And so I fought this advertising agency. I fought them. And then once we'd hit roughly around 8 to 10,000, I think it was somewhere between 8 and 10,000, I said, go ahead, now you can spend the money. And that was it was on Christmas time, right? And we did this, we had Subway buy, whatever it is, we put something big in the marketplace. I had not made any money yet. I was in a total loss scenario for 3 months, right, at that point. And the minute we hit 10,000 and I released that advertising, we didn't have a losing month for 5 months after that, losing week for 5 months, right? And it was like, I rolled the dice, right? This is the risk part of the scenario. I rolled the dice and I said, I believe this to be true. I'm in charge of the purse strings. This is what we're going to do. And of course, everyone's telling me I'm wrong and they're telling me I know. Like, anecdote of that story, that advertising agency soon got fired because it was like, well, you were wrong and that was the consequence. I found this to be true. Like, yes, you have to deliver a good product. You must deliver a solid product. It must be good. But it kind of doesn't, like, but at the end of the day, how we all buy things is through word of mouth. I mean, like, we're in this culture where everyone's talking about influencers. It's just word of mouth. It's just people with larger, it's not anything different than word of mouth. It's just they're just doing it on different platforms than they used to. But consumers, to part them from their hard-earned dollar, they want to trust someone else to tell them to do it, right? And this hasn't changed in generations, right?
One of the things you're alluding to is that it requires some kind of breaking through all this other noise that's out there. Sure. Like you were alluding to in New York, it's this dense media market with all these different distractions and all these attractions and distractions. And what you're saying is, how do you break through? That's the key. How do you? So
that's the marketing brain, which is what's my strategy to break through in this scenario, right? Like, because like, what are the variables that I'm dealing with? What is the strategy I'm going to take to break through? What are the things that I know to be true? And what are the things that I don't know? And how are we going to assemble a picture in order to break through? And you know, you've got to build it a way where you're mitigating risk at all times, and you're learning from every mistake you're making, right? Because you want to be able to continue the product. Like the hardest part is like when you have something that doesn't work, sometimes it just doesn't work, right? Like sometimes, like I was a co-producer on one of my favorite plays of all time. I absolutely love this play, which is Terrence McNally's Frankie and Johnny and the Clair de Lune. I think it is a absolutely beautiful picture and portrait of two very damaged human beings who come together and their broken pieces fit, right? They make up the right puzzle at the end of this play. And I just think it's like, and it's such a quintessential like New York story, which is something that I do love. I've always loved New York stories. And I didn't see the original, but I saw the revival with Edie Falco and Stanley Tucci. That was just an absolutely mind-blowing production, right? It was absolutely one of the best pieces of theater I've ever seen in my life. The chemistry they had on stage was great. So the opportunity came up again back in 2018, where it was going to be on Broadway with two actors who I think are absolutely amazing. I said, let's go be co-producers on it, right? And it was back when I had my own production company. And we did. And the sad thing is a friend of ours walked out of the show during previews and said, this beautiful story of where she sleeps with this guy, like they've known each other, and then they kind of like they have this tumultuous evening, like it's kind of this beautiful thing. In 2018, he was like, this is a play about a girl who can't get a guy out of her apartment after she asks him to leave multiple times. And I was like, oh God. I'm like, you're absolutely right. Like, you're absolutely right. Like, we are in a Me Too moment right now where all you hear as an audience member is Audra McDonald telling Michael Shannon to leave her apartment and he refuses to go. This is kind of terrible at this moment in time, right? Like,
Yes.
And it doesn't mean that the play was bad. It just means like, this should not have been produced right now.
Because you had an audience not ready for it at that moment.
Well, the times had changed, right? Like times had changed. Simply,
sure.
Right? We had an entirely different point of view of what the situation was between these two characters. Not that it was written at all, but the audience tastes had changed.
And this is true for a whole range of products that just over time outlive their time. I mean, how many people have ever seen a show called The Voice of the Turtle, which ran for, I don't know, something like 2,000 performances on Broadway back in the 30s? That's what you're talking about, is that it's outlived its time. So it still is a great play. That's not in doubt. It's that the tastes, the mores have changed.
Yeah, the culture shifts.
So are you producing 20-Sided Tavern in Chicago? Is that what's going on right now?
Yeah.
Tell us about Gamiotics.
Let's back up a step. Okay. So back around the early days of the production company, I came across a play that was a rom-com play about this guy who's very unlucky in love. And this genie shows up whose society is going to help him find the perfect girl for him, right? But the trick is when the audience walked into the theater, they were handed an ABCD push button remote. Like, everybody was handed one. And at these various points during the show, the audience would vote, right? Because it was tied to off-the-shelf, very simple educational polling software on what the guy should do next. And it was linearly constructed. And so they would vote, and they would vote on various things like what line should be said here, what location they should go, like all these things. And it was the first time that I had ever seen a successful execution of a branching narrative story on stage where the audience could make the decisions that affected the show. Because like, you gotta have 15, 20 choices during the course of the show. And then there were like 10, 15 different endings, right? So if the audience, and there was an internal point system that was built in the show. And if the audience voted very favorably for the guy all the way through the show, he'd sleep with a girl at the end. They voted very negatively for him, he'd throw himself off a bridge at the end, right? And then like 10 different possible endings in between. And I was like, I had never seen on the live stage anything that had ever done this, like not only throughout the show, but was constructed and the audience loved it. And I remember being like, there's something happening here that is potentially way ahead of its time. I need to get him to be involved. Now, I am a big video gamer. Like, I am a huge, like, I've been playing computer games since I was 7 years old. I love board games. I am a gamer at heart, and I'd always had been, but then I, had this career in theater. I just remember thinking, God, I love the unification here, right? Of these two concepts. I love the idea of gaming, right? And this idea of choice and this idea of I'm playing a show. And so I optioned the show. Now, problem with the show was kind of two major problems. The first was scalability, right? You can't hand an audience something to use when they come to the show. All you're doing is creating many, many, many problems. And it's not something that you can easily replicate. It's not something that needs to be done. Like, you can't scale it. Like, it's fine for 100, 150 people, but beyond that, it's not something that's actually really possible. And then the actual like technical thing of the polling software wasn't that interesting at the end of the day. But I thought, all right, there's an idea there. And I talked to the author. I was like, and he said, we thought about doing an app, but we decided not to. Apps at that point, back in 2015, they're like, it costs about $300,000 to make. And I was like, I don't think it's an app, but we'll come back to that. The other problem with the show is that the author, one of the things that the genie manifested were the women that he could go on a date with, right? And this male genie plucked 3 women, right, who were cast in the show, right? Because like whichever woman got chosen, the other 2 played all the incidental roles, right? And so it's just kind of, that's what would happen there, right? But they were all kind of very deeply broken women in their own right, just like the main character. And like, and this is in 15, 16. It was like, oh, well, this is kind of problematic that you have this kind of male author and this male genie who's created this male genie and this male character who's kind of a like schlubby loser. manifest these women that get to be like, that's probably not a great idea. So we did a reading of the show, went over like a lead balloon. Everybody loved the concept of it. And I go back to the author and I said, here's pages and pages and pages of notes, right? 3 months go by, the author hands in a script with absolutely zero changes. And I thought, oh God. I'm like, okay. I mean, you're a writer, like especially after being in Hollywood, is like, you got to take the note.
You got to take the notes.
Got to take the note, right? And the author absolutely refused to take the note. And I was like, well, I have your option for another year. See you in June, dude. Like, there's no, like, I can't work with you. But during this time period is when I was trying to do the development with him on the script and not realize, and like, I had these long meetings with him and give all these notes. I didn't realize that he was just like, this guy's a jerk. Like, my show's perfect. Nothing's wrong with it. I was like, I had no idea he was that kind of author, right? But during this time, through a very kind of lucky set of circumstances, I got hooked up with this software engineer by the name of Dave Keane, who at one point in his career was the senior architect of the PlayStation Gaming Network, right? Helped build the PlayStation Gaming Network. He was a big theater lover and had a meeting. And I said, look, I have this weird problem, which is I have this concept, right? But I don't have execution. He's like, well, let's build an app. And I said, okay, the problem with an app in live entertainment, and remember, this is back in 2016, 2017, whenever it was. I said, if I'm going to the theater, and I make this point, it's like, I immediately put myself into the consumer mindset, right? When approaching this problem. It's like, what is it as an audience member, right? Because I had already said, you can't hand them something in the theater. So if it's like 8:05 and the show starts at 8 and I'm late and it's raining and I've had a bad day, and I didn't read any of my pre-emails that tell me, my pre-show emails that tell me all my instructions on what to do. And I show up at the theater and the usher says, oh no, before you can go in and enjoy the show, you have to download this app, right? Onto your phone.
Right.
I'm going to be mad. I was like, I paid $50 or 100, whatever it is. Like, I don't want to do anything. I just want to show up and forget about my day, right?
Exactly.
And so I said, it can't be an app. It has to be, and back then it was like 2 clicks and in. Right? There has to be 2 touch points and we got to be into the thing. So Dave went back and he built the early version of Gamiotics, an entirely web-based platform, meaning that you go to a website, like whatever it was back then, right? But you go to a web, you entered a URL on your phone that was easy to enter, and then you enter in a code, and then that's it. And then you're in. And what Gamiotics is that it is web-based software that allows for a two-way communication between audience and content during the course of live event. That's what it does. It is a communication device, right? What it can do is it can be a platform that you can build these types of stories that we're going to talking about on this platform that have never been built before for live entertainment, right? And it creates the ability for 300, 500, 1,000, whatever the number is, right? People to collectively make decisions in an environment in real time that are affecting what's happening on stage. That's what Gamiotics does.
Or even not in the same place.
Or not in the same place, which is another application for it, right? So Dave started building this for us. And he was an original partner in the company. Dave started building this for us. And then I had this big fight with the author, and the author goes away. And suddenly I'm like, well, I have this technology, but I have no show, right? So right about that time, Puffs had opened and Puffs was turning into a big hit. And so I went to that Puffs team and I said, all right, I want you to build me a show, right? That uses this software. And so I spent 2.5 years and a lot of money developing a show that I never got off the ground whatsoever, right? In 2019, my last ditch effort to try and make this thing work, because I was really like, there were so many things about the show that were working, but I was still so invested in the concept and the idea, right? We did a series of 7 stage readings over 9 weeks, which took about 2 months, right? Because part of the problem with this type of narrative that we're developing is like, you can only develop it in front of an audience because you have to learn what the audience chooses at various points in time, right? Sure. And we'd done a full production of the show previously, but it just wasn't working yet. And one of my dear friends, an Australian producer who I absolutely love, who happened to be in New York, came and saw the show, and he walked out and he said, you don't have a show, you have a platform, go into the platform. That's what I want. That's what you need to do. And I said, all right. I was like, you're right, because I don't have a show. This thing isn't working. I cannot get this thing to work. So a lot of things happen at once, right? As that was happening, and I was trying to figure out what to do, about a month later, both Bob Winkle and Todd Hames, who are preeminent theater owners in New York, called me and said, I hear you're working on Slava Snow Show. I got 8 weeks this Christmas. Can you bring it in this Christmas? And this was in June. And I said, all right, like, okay. Because it was, and you know, Broadway, right? Like,
that's
something
fast.
that most people in the world don't know is that there is a small number of people on the earth who've ever received that phone call. And I had been working 20 years to have Bob Winkle call me on my cell phone. I ended up going with this theater, right? And say, I want you to bring in a show. Because it's a club. It's a very small club of people who get that phone.
Very
right?
small.
And so when that call happened, I said, I have to do this, right? Like I've been this is what I've been working for. And so we put everything on hold with that show, with Gamiotics on hold. And I went out and I went and produced Slava Snow Show, right? And unfortunately, the result of producing Slava Snow Show broke my partnership up. The partnership that I had in that production company, which was called Tilted Windmills, like was rendered, right? Like during the course of that show for a lot of reasons that I won't go into. But when the ashes had cooled, when the dust had settled and the lawyers were done with us, what I was left with was Gamiotics. And this was in January of 2020. And I remember I was sitting with my lawyer at one point. The breakup was bad. Like, of course, I mean, like, if you've ever been in partnerships before, sometimes when they go south, they really go south. And this one really went south.
Yes, they can go south.
And I was in a dogfight. But the thing that everyone was fighting over, honestly, was Gamiotics, right? And I came out the winner in that one, right? But as this big fight was happening, my lawyer had said to me, she's like, you're talented. You know what you're doing. Like, I can get you a job at Netflix. I can get you a job at Universal. I can get you a job anywhere. She knows a lot of people in the entertainment industry. She's like, you don't have to do this. You don't have to fight. You can just walk away from all of this. Because it was really tough. It was a bad battle. And I said, Evelyn, I was like, and I love this lawyer. She's one of my favorite people in the world. I said, Evelyn, like, look, I believe in this idea. I am not finished yet. I've got to try and finish this. And she said, all right, then we'll get it. And we'll get it for you. But she's like, it's going to cost you a lot of money, which it did. And I said, all right. So January 20, I said, I started recapitalizing the company. I was putting to bed all the problems that were going on. I was starting, and I'd hired a couple of writers. I said, all right, I have this Gamiotics software. This is the type of show that I want. I want you guys to write it. And the pandemic hit in March.
Yes.
And everything evaporated literally within a week. All of my money went out the door. The writers walked from me. Like, the whole thing just went up the air. I was sitting where I'm sitting right now, staring at the wall going, oh God, now what? I thought, all right, well, you made a decision. You chose a path, stick with it. And I called a group of friends together and I said, you're all out of work, right? You're all collecting unemployment right now. Like, I have a little bit of money left. Let's start writing shows for people at home using Zoom as a platform and using this technology for them to interact. And let's actually figure out what this is. And this team of people, which grew over time, in 18 months, we wrote 20-hour-long live shows that were all interactive. And we did choose your adventures and styles and branching narratives and game shows and quiz shows and murder mysteries and all these things. It was on this platform we called Seize the Show that doesn't exist anymore. And we would write for 3 weeks and perform for 3 weeks. And our actor friends were doing it, and everybody was in different states, and we're all doing it through Zoom. And it was a crazy experience. And what ended up happening was I actually learned what I had set out to do during that time period, right? I actually was saying, if you have this piece of interactive story, really what it comes down to is saying, you have this piece of interactive technology for live entertainment, well, what can you do with it? And so we set out and we just did with it. One of the things that we did was a live action Dungeons and Dragons style show, right? And I had these two partners, Sarah Reynolds and David Laws. Sarah was working for me at the time on production, and David was a writer of mine. And Caesar Show was winding down. This would have been about May 21. And I had realized that, like, this Zoom platform for live performance was a dead end, right? Because of course it is. Like, no one wants to experience live entertainment on Zoom, full stop, right? It is not a thing that people want to do. I was shutting down production, and I was talking to my investors about it and saying, look, I'm going to pivot right now, right? Because I'm a technology startup, right? I'm going to pivot right now, and we're really going to lean into because I know what the possibilities of the technology are. Now I know things are due. I need to sit down and rewrite the business plan. we're gonna shut everything down, and I'm gonna go through the summer while I really go after my seed funding, right? Because I just completed about $500,000 in angel funding at that point, and so I'm gonna take the rest of this money that I have, and I'm gonna figure out how to get to seed funding now over the next several months. It's what you do in startup world, but it's simply how you operate, right? This thing is not making enough money. We learned the development phase. We're moving on to the next phase right now. So I was moving to the next phase.
So you needed to go seek funding from people.
Oh yeah, I never stop raising money. One thing as a producer, you never are not raising money, right? Ever. You're always raising money. Everything you do at the end of the day ends up having to contribute to raising money, right?
So you have to be good at that.
You have to be at least passable at it, right? Like, you have to, like, you got to close some deals. Like, yeah, it helps if you're good at it. And I'm not great at it. I am good enough, right? Some people might say I'm good at it, but anyway, the one thing out of all these 20 productions that we've done was this D&D show. And I went back to Sarah and David and I said, of everything that we've done a lot of great stuff, and you guys have worked on a lot of great stuff. This is the one that I actually think has legs here. And I want to continue developing this with you two, but I don't want to do it. I want you two to be my partners in developing this, right? So I don't want a writer-producer relationship. I want a partnership between the three of us to build a production company to execute this idea. And they said, okay. And they're like, okay, fine. Like sounds fun. Let's start mapping it out. We spent the summer talking about it, and we had this opportunity. And if you remember, everyone's memories going back to COVID are very fuzzy, but mine are pretty crystal clear. There was a moment where the summer opened up, right? And as we were going in September, people were starting to leave their houses again. It was right before we started going back into these waves of COVID, right? Because the summer caused the fall wave. So we had this opportunity to put up Twenty-Sided Tavern for 2 performances at the Philadelphia Fringe Festival. And we took it. It's just going to cost us like $5,000. Like, it was nothing money. I thought, let's just go and let's just do it and see what happens at Philly Fringe. It's an opportunity. It's out of New York. Let's go. And lo and behold, we put it up, and people came out of the woodwork to see this, but it was all gamers and D&D fans. And they came in groups of 5 because they came with their D&D group that they've been playing with all through the pod. And of course, as you know, D&D has had a massive resurgence. You know, the pandemic helped, but it's on a huge upswing right now. And we did this show, and the exact same thing that happened in 2015 while I was watching Puffs happen again, which is I saw a people who don't care about anything else in their lives. The fact that somebody was producing a show that they felt was aimed squarely at them got them out of their house to come see the show, because no one had ever put this idea of storytelling and gaming and interaction and agency together on the stage this way. And it worked. And I knew right from the first moment, literally from the first moment the thing started, I was like, this is the next thing. I'm like, this is the next thing that we're going to do. And that was about 1.5 years ago, right? A little less than 1.5 years ago.
And you still need quality product.
Oh, sure. I mean, this was folding tables and a box of props, right? Like, I'm not kidding. I got, like, the pictures that I have from that, like, compared to what I'm doing right now, it's like nothing. What you need is an unbreakable concept. Like, the thing has to work, whether you have folding tables and box of props or $1 million production. It has to connect with the audience on an emotional level. No matter what the value spend any party is making, they have to connect with it. And this thing connected out of the gate immediately. And I just knew, I was like, we're onto something. But for a long time, we didn't know what we were onto. We just kept doing this. So what we started doing is we just started doing random performances in New York, right? We did it at the theater now doesn't no longer exist. There's this theater in Chelsea. It's called the Asylum. It's about 150 seats theater. It's in the basement of a Gristedes. I kid you not. And we went to the guy who ran it and said, hey, we want a night. Can we get a night? We actually want 4 nights in November, December. And so in between these bouts of COVID, we put it up, and it was all just like inviting friends and family to get it. And by the time we did our 4th one in December, we sold out just on word of mouth alone, right? And I said, oh, okay, all right, something's happening, but I still don't know what we have. We didn't know what we had, basically the concept of the show, and I'll explain how Gamiotics works with it, right, is that a Dungeons & Dragons style game is you have a dungeon master create a story world, and then you have 3 or 4 players who are all coming with their own characters and classes and attributes, right? So you have a mage, and you have a fighter, you have a rogue, you have a wizard, like whatever it is you're going to gather together. And the dungeon master, the game master, you don't know what's going to happen. They read the story to you, and then you have to start making decisions, right? And then things have to happen, and you have to roll die that affect the outcome of the decision that you made. So, it's a 20-sided die, hence the 20-sided tavern. And if you roll a 20, it's perfect. You roll a 1, it's terrible, and all the things in between. And there are all these mechanics and metrics and all these things that go into playing this game. It is the basis of modern day role-playing game. What we created was this game on stage. We had 3 actors play a fighter, mage, and rogue, right? And then the audience, using Gamiotics from their seats, right, from their phones on their seats, would make decisions that affected the gameplay and what's happening on stage. And so the idea is that everybody at a D&D style game is contributing to the storytelling. Instead of putting on a show for an audience, we made them part of the experience and part of the show, where they had stakes in the outcome. They had a choice. They had agency in the outcome of what was happening collectively as an audience every night. And we did, and that was the basis of Seize the Show, but that's what we did with 20-Sided Tavern.
And thus the word immersive.
And thus the word immersive, right? Because it is a piece of immersive entertainment at that stage. I talked to our friend Mark Fleischer at Pittsburgh CLO. So Mark, when I closed Puffs in New York in August of 2019, and Mark bought my set because he was planning a production of Puffs in 2020 that didn't happen until last year, right?
Right.
Mark and I were friends, and Mark is like, "Oh, I'm going to buy the set from you. I'm going to put it in storage." It's like, great. So we knew each other, and he had called me in the fall of 21 and said, "Hey, I need some marketing tips on how to sell Puffs because I'm going to be doing it this spring. I'm going to do it in May." I was like, "Oh, great." And we started talking. I was telling him, I was like, "All right, here are some of the rules. This is what you do. This is what I would advise you to do in this scenario." Blah, blah, blah. And he said, "What are you working on anything right now?" I was like, "Well, actually, I'm working on this D&D show. It's called the 20-Sided Tavern." And I started telling you about it. And he's like, "How fast can you bring it in?" And I'm like, and this was November, right? And I was like, "When do you need it by?" He said, "I need it by April." I said, "Okay." And I literally was just like, "Okay." Like, I didn't have a show, Steve. Like, we didn't have anything at all.
Wow,
I didn't have designers. I didn't have anything. And Mark said, well, how much is it going to cost? And we ran budgets, and I'm like, if you throw in 100, I'll throw in 100. He's like, "Okay, done, deal." I mean, like, that's literally what we what we did, right? With how we shook hands on the deal, and off we went, right?
Just so the listeners know, we're talking about Mark Fleischer, who runs the Pittsburgh Civic Light Opera, the CLO.
Yeah. One of the smartest, most innovative men working in American theater. I kid you not. Like, that guy had, I mean, like, when you are lucky enough in life to meet someone who has vision and can see your vision, like, hold on to that person for dear life, right? Like because, like, you very rarely you're going to find someone who gets what you're talking about immediately and say, "That's a brilliant idea." And part of it was, what I'd said to Mark was, I'm getting an audience that I've never seen before at the theater. And he said, "I want that. I want that too, right? At my theater." Because for CLO and for any institution in American theater, part of what your job is to attract the audiences of tomorrow. It's not just about the audience today. You've always got to be working on your pipeline.
It's well known that theater audiences nationwide have been trending toward older people, and that the development of a younger audience is critical to the survival of theater as a whole.
And I'm doing a show that involves gaming and RPGs and, like, these D&D style things that are happening. He was like, "I don't know he's like, I am not this person. I see what you're doing." Right. So we shut down in January and retooled because, like, we in the creative team were like, "Oh God, we have to hire people. We have to build it. I got to raise money. I got to go figure this thing out." And so I had to fast go find 6 figures, like, right quick. Had to go out the door and be like, "All right, we have this opportunity. We got to execute it. Blah, blah. And we got to figure out. We got to build a show." And so we brought the show in. So one of the things that we did is, we rented the asylum for a week in February. So we quiet in January, end of February, we did a week in New York, quiet in March, and then we went up in April in Pittsburgh, right? So we took that week to work on the campaign that the team had written for Pittsburgh. We're going to test it out in front of an audience, right? So that space had a gross potential of, like, I don't know, $12,000 or whatever it was at that time, right? The asylum did. And this time around, I was like, all right, well, I have a lot more inventory. I can't do this through word of mouth. I actually got to spend some money on advertising dollars. And all I did was spend about $2,000 to advertise to gamers and D&D fans on Facebook right? Which is entirely legal to do, right? In every form. And I sold that week out. And that's all I did was saying, hey, we exist. And we sold, and they came in droves. And that was kind of that moment of being like, oh, this is continuing to operate in a way that is right. And I'm also unfamiliar with, let's lean further into this direction. And so we did Pittsburgh. We had about 18 performances in Pittsburgh over the course of 3 weeks. We built it was in their cabaret theater, which I think is under renovation. If you've ever been to the cabaret, but it's a food and beverage operation, right?
Many times.
But it was a thrust stage, and the concept behind the high level concept behind the show is that in its ultimate production, this show, it's this experience meets immersive Van Gogh, where if we're traveling through a story world that is ever changing around us, then the visual world needs to be ever changing. And so a lot of what we're doing is projection, right? To create the scenic world, because it's a dungeon crawler in its own right, that the audience is choosing throughout the course of the show to go to these different places within this castle, right? Effectively, these different dungeon rooms. And so we got to reflect it by the visuals, right?
Is the audience physically getting up and moving, or are they staying in their seats?
No, it's all from their seat, right? It's all taking place from their seat. So we changed the story world around. That's why I say it's immersive Van Gogh, right? Mm-hmm. So that the visuals are changing around them, but it's not like we're moving set pieces or anything. It's like, no, we're all doing it through projection, and it's very video game in its own right, that and in terms of the style and thing that we're after. And so that's we put up the first idea of that in Pittsburgh. And what happened in Pittsburgh was really extraordinary, because we followed that same playbook, right? Of saying, this is how you advertise, right? Now, April of 22, right? This past April, last April, right? There was no competition in the market. So that's really, really important. Like, that's where we got lucky. That's where luck comes into play, in that we come to town, nothing else is happening. So I didn't have to compete with Wicked to get ticket buyers into a stage house, right?
Right, sure.
We had to tell gamers and DD fans, hey, we're here, you're going to love us. And they showed up in droves. But what was more interesting about that was that they came in costume, right? From first performance, you have people coming in Ren Fair coming, but it grew to the environment that we created in Pittsburgh was that by the end of the run, it looked like the floor of Comic-Con. Right, that we created this safe space for nerds in a live theatrical environment to come hang with us for a couple of hours and play this show and have a good time, but in a theater, in a cabaret theater, right, in this big cabaret theater, and you had families dressed up as the entire traveling party from Lord of the Rings. I mean, people are so eager to get out of the house, but also like just the elaborate costumes. You can see them on our Instagram. They'd come, and it was a Comic-Con party. And that's when I knew what we had was something unlike anything else in the world, right?
Yeah, that's completely unique. There's no question about that. And you're also introducing a huge number of people to the theater itself that maybe have never been exposed to the theater.
Have never been, right. But the biggest thing that we've learned on this journey, we're not doing theater.
What are you doing?
It's not theater, right? We are doing storytelling. We are doing gaming. We are doing performance. We are not doing theater.
It's an event.
It's an experience. It's an interactive experience.
Immersive, interactive experience. That's really great.
Yeah. I mean, when you invent something new, when you do something new, it's exciting, right?
You are clearly passionate about what you do, and that is a wonderful thing to see. Because not everybody is passionate about what they do, and you are very passionate about what you do. So we're going to, at this point, wind the show down a little bit, and maybe I'll have you back on another StoryBeat episode and have you rip this down even further, because I think I
feel like there's a part 2 to talk about dynamic storytelling, which is what we do.
Yeah, I think we'll absolutely do that. So meanwhile, I'm just curious, you've obviously met and worked with lots of very interesting people in your career, and I'm wondering, in all of your experiences, can you share with us an oddball story that's weird, quirky, offbeat, or maybe just plain funny?
If you're a TikTok follower, right, which I'm sure some of your users are, one of my favorite people on TikTok is this woman named Miriam Margolis. Miriam Margolis played Professor Snow in the Potter movies, right?
She's an actual character in life.
And she is an actual character. We had her do our announcement of Puffs in Australia, which the Potter lawyers went furious with me over, right? Like I got railed on, right? And it was delightful. And part of it was just like, it was fun to work with someone as weird and quirky as that, who was also interested in poking a stick in someone's eye. So like, find those people. They're fun.
I've only seen her do her thing, and I've certainly seen her on talk shows and so on. She's a real character.
Yeah, she's a real character. Yeah, really, really, really admire her.
She's very, very, very funny and raw. She's a raw person. There's just almost no filter.
Yeah. And we didn't think she would do it. And she was like, I'm all in on this. This sounds great.
Wonderful.
Like, okay, we're going to get in trouble. She's like, I don't care.
So last question for you today, David. I'm just wondering, you've already given us a whole lot of stuff to chew on and a lot of great advice along the way, but do you have a solid piece of advice or a tip that you like to give to people who are starting out in the business, or maybe they're in a little bit and trying to get to the next level? What kind of advice do you give people?
So many, and this is the advice that I always give. So many times in our career, we're measuring ourselves against other people. We're measuring ourselves against other people's success and other people who've done stuff in the world. And I always say to people, the only race you're in is the one against yourself. Cut out the clutter. Don't worry about what anybody else is doing. Only worry about the race you're running against yourself, and that's it. You are only competing with yourself. And I feel it's really important that, like, especially in this celebrity obsessed culture that we're in, it gets in everywhere, and especially in work opportunities. Like, oh, that person's my age, but they have more money. That hasn't anything to do with you. That is not about you at all. That's entirely about them. Focus on the race you're running and what your goals are, and what your success, and define success for yourself, not against somebody else.
That is a really wonderful, solid piece of advice, because most people are trying to be someone else, at least at the beginning of their careers, and just be you. I think that's because if you have something special to give to the world, which I think many people do, that's on you to give to the world, not on you to be someone else.
Yeah, 100%.
David Carpenter, this has been a fantastic episode of StoryBeat, and I can't thank you enough for spending some time with us today. Thank you so much.
Thank you. I appreciate you letting me ramble on so much. I appreciate it.
And so we've come to the end of today's StoryBeat. If you like this episode, won't you please take a moment to give us a comment, rating, or review on whatever app or platform you're listening to. Your support helps us bring more great StoryBeat episodes to you. StoryBeat is available on all major podcast apps and platforms, including Apple Podcasts, YouTube, Spotify, iHeartRadio, Stitcher, TuneIn, and many others. Until next time, I'm Steve Cuden, and may all your stories be unforgettable.